Hey everyone and welcome to my Jhin win guide. I've been wanting to make comp guide videos for a long time now, but was way too slow off the mark and set 8.5. So I've decided to do one now coming into the end of the set, especially with the recent Jhin buffs. I think this board here, with just Oxforce Renegade Riftwalker, playing this default as your AD board and being able to flex around it, will get you a lot of top 4s and farm you Infinite LP. This video is going to be broken down into 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about the early game and when you should look to play this board. Then we're going to go into stabilizing / econ during the mid game. And then later on, we're going to talk about the late game and potential boards that you can play. It doesn't have to be this board every time. There are definitely some other variations that are quite powerful as well. So without any further ado, let's jump into the early game. Okay, the good thing about this board, the Jhin board in particular, is there's not a whole lot of early game units / indicators that will 100% make you play it. It's not like you pick an augment at the start of the game and you're forced to play Jhin from that angle. You can always flex around whatever you pick during the early game. In saying that, there are a couple of really good augments and hero augments especially to play in the early game that make it really easy to transition into a Jhin board. So for example, you can consider going Renegade Heart in the early game. I think Renegade Heart is a lot better than Renegade Emblem, just because it allows you to fit an entire other unit on the board in the late game, and there aren't a lot of units that benefit heaps off of the Renegade Emblem anyway, except maybe an Asol or a Belveth, for example. It also allows you to play 3 Renegade early on. Now, whilst I don't think Renegade is the strongest early trait ever, it does give you a fair bit of damage, especially if you have like a Lucian 2 and maybe an early static shift slammed on him. It can end up saving you a lot of HP. You could also go Brawlers instead of the admin if you wanted. You could drop out of the quick draw and play a Camille for the extra bonus damage. You will lose like quick draw on Lucian, but that doesn't really matter if you've got bonus damage anyway. I think 9 times out of 10, you're just going to be playing strongest board at the start of the game, especially if you start with Renegade Heart. And if you're considering leaning into Jhin, you almost always want to level up to have a better chance at hitting your later game units earlier on. I don't think there's a huge amount of hero augments that work incredibly well with Jhin, early hero augments I mean, but there are definitely a couple ones that make the transitioning a lot easier into playing Jhin later game. So I'm just going to go ahead and list all of those now and bring them up on the screen. For the 1 costs, you could definitely do Hyperbolic Time Chamber Lucian. I think is a fantastic tempo hero augment and just makes it really easy to level up. I actually think it's one of the most broken hero augments in the game. Both the Pike ones are good. I've been experimenting with them a fair bit and I actually prefer the one that gives you a free shot refresh, just because again it makes it so much easier to find the relevant units that you need, makes it heaps easier to hit upgrades and like stabilize your board a lot harder during the mid game. If there's any time where your renegades will struggle, it's during the mid game, especially if you haven't hit upgrades, so I really like that one. However, small game hunter as well is very powerful, especially when you get the Jhin, because you can target the backline, giving you a ton of bonus damage to the enemy carries. You could also go Camille Hextech Retribution early on. This is an alright hero augment. The only issue I have with it is it forces you to play Camille for the entire game, and 9 times out of 10, if you get a Renegade +1, then Camille's the first unit that you drop. But if you have Hextech Retribution, then guess what? You're playing it the entire time, and you just have to suck it up. Good items that you consider slamming in the early game is any tank item that will fit onto your tank units later. Like, literally any single one of them to slam is totally fine. You have to be a little bit more careful with the AD items. I mean, Jhin can use a lot of them, but there are items that he performs really well with and some that he doesn't perform well with. For example, Runan's Hurricane's okay because it increases his raw AD, but items like IE, Deathblade, and Giant Slayer are all pretty much best in slot gym items, so slamming any of those early game is going to be fine. Giant Slayer and IE are better slams than Deathblade, just because they allow you to flex into more comps, whereas Deathblade is pretty much only good on Jhin. I mean, it's fine on any other AD carry, but it's really good on Jhin. Last Whisper Slam is fine, don't get me wrong. He prefers the other items more, but if all you have is Last Whisper, like don't hold it on your bench and Greed. It doesn't make that much of a difference. So you can just go ahead and slam that as well, that's fine. Oh, and finally, Static Shiv is always a very slammable item in the early game, so you can definitely just slam a Static Shiv as well for infinite tempo. And the last thing to keep in mind is that if you have a Thief's Gloves, like if you get Thief's Gloves +1, or if you have no other items and you need to slam something for tempo, there are a lot of units in this comp that can use Thief's Gloves. Like technically Jhin can, you probably don't want to do that unless it's absolutely necessary because you'll lose the game. But units like Belveth like Thief's Gloves, your frontline is fine with Thief's Gloves, and Viego really benefits off Thief's Gloves as well. So if you need to slam this for tempo, you definitely can, even though there are a lot of items that can utilize the gloves. Not in most cases, it's going to be more important to play tempo than it will be to greed for other items. So Thief's Gloves, totally fine to slam as well. Okay, now we're going to talk about the mid game and how you can transition this board, when to level, when not to level, and mid game hero augments as well. So in the mid game, you can use your sure shots. That's totally fine. I have no problem with that. I find Vayne to be a very consistent item holder as well. Something like 4 duelists plus whatever frontline you hit is actually a very, very consistent mid game board, especially if you high roll something like a Vayne 2 or a Nyla 2. But even with just the Vayne 1 with 4 duelists on, she does a lot of true damage. Also, Vayne's one of the best users of Deathblade in the game as well. Pretty much the 2 units that like Deathblade the most are going to be Vayne and Jhin, just because Vayne does a lot of true damage, which scales off of her raw AD, so having a lot of raw AD on her is delicious. And then Jhin likes it because he also likes raw AD, because reasons. So Vayne at the moment is probably my favourite mid-game holder. The only thing you have to be careful of is playing a lot of duelists is going to absolutely grief your hero augment if you don't already have a hero augment. So you maybe want to consider just putting on 3 renegades, even if you know your board's going to suck, until you can actually get a hero augment going. One of the biggest problems with this board that I have is that 3-cost hero augments absolutely suck. I don't think there's a single 3-cost hero augment that I actually really like for this board. The Vex one that buffs your team is okay, but if you're looking to play Jhin, then you don't really want a Vex hero augment because it only really buffs the AP, so it doesn't actually do a whole lot. Again, both Pike ones are good, so if it's 2 and 3 costs, you probably want to go for the Pike ones over the Vex ones anyway. Morgana and Rammus augments are alright as well, like Gas Giant Slayer is really, really good, so that's fine to take, it feels alright. If you're going to take a Rammus one, you might want to consider rolling for Rammus 3, or you just take it to tempo now and then get out of it later. That is going to make your board a lot weaker because you're not going to be playing Rammus the entire time, but sometimes you have to do what you have to do. You can also take like an Alistair hero augment as well and make him your main tank. Again, the biggest issue I have with these is that they're just not very good. Like even Behemoth, the one that gives him some extra HP and does more damage and more healing, it doesn't do a whole lot. If you get him to 3-star, it's alright at best. So if you do happen to find 3-cost hero augments, yeah, there's not a whole lot of great options for you. Maybe consider rolling out of it and playing something like a duelist instead. You can still make it work, you just won't be as strong as what you want to be. With that in mind, your mid-game board could look something like this. Again, all you really want for the mid-game is just frontline plus whatever backline you can. If you high roll something like a Belveth, you can also use Belveth as your main item holder instead of a Vayne or instead of 4 shots because she'll be a lot stronger. And then you really just want to start collecting as many units as you can. If you're leaning towards Oxforce, that's fine because Oxforce Jhin is pretty strong. But keep in mind, it's not the only way to play this board. So you don't necessarily have to only hold the Oxforce, and you don't have to play the Oxforce frontline. Focus on whatever frontline is going to be the strongest for you, and that will just depend on what units you're hitting. Alright, that's going to be it for the mid game. It's basically just play your strongest board and hope you high roll decent hero augments. That's really all I can say. 9 times out of 10, you will try not to be rolling too much on 6 because you want to go to 7 and you want to roll down on 7. The reason for that is because you can find a lot of units on 7 and this board stabilizes really hard off of 1 Jhin. So let's just go ahead and move on to the late game and assume that we're rolling down and we've found a Jhin or 2. Okay, now this is the fun part. You've level 7 rolled down. Your board could look something like this. This is totally fine here. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of other units that you can be playing, but you definitely want your 3 Riftwalker, and then what else you play will depend on what you have. If you have a Renegade +1, then you can consider playing 5 Renegade. I'm not too sure that I would recommend it at this stage of the game on level 7, just because you're going to sacrifice a lot of frontline for some extra damage in the backline, and Renegade is really going to help you out a lot more after you hit Jhin 2. So for now, your board is 9 times out of 10 just going to be stronger with a better frontline, plus maybe some extra damage carries in the back. This is one version of the board here where you utilize a couple of threat units. Eventually, you're going to want to drop down to having less threats and having something like 4 Ox in the front. 2 Ox Force is totally fine as well. For example, you could drop the Alistair and the Annie, or you could drop the Fiora and the Annie, play 2 Ox Force, which is fine, and then flex threat units around that. That's also pretty good. Something like this with a Renegade +1, you can get 5 Renegades pretty easily on a level 7 roll down. You can just add in a random Camille, Silas, or if you Giga High Roll and hit a Leona, you can put that in instead. In this version of the board, you want to make Aatrox the main tank because he's going to be much tankier than what Alistair is. And this board on level 7 will be totally fine as well. And as long as you hit some upgrades, should be stable enough to carry you to level 8. Now, level 8 boards. This is basically going to be talking about what boards you're actually going to play in the late game, which will carry you through all the way to the end. So there's a couple of variations depending on what augments and stuff you've hit. So let's just go over them. Okay, so the first board assumes that you've hit a Renegade +1 throughout the game. Considering that you can make a Renegade emblem using a spat, and there's a ton of augments that give you +1 Renegade as well, it's not that uncommon to have a Renegade +1, so this on level 8 is a very realistic board. All we've done is we've just played the 4 Ox Force units and we've gone 5 Renegade. This is a really good one to consider if not only you have a Renegade +1, but maybe you have some extra AP items as well, and you can put them on your Viego. The reason why this works out okay is because Ox Force doesn't generally get a lot stronger if you have a bunch of tank items. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference because of the shields they get anyway. So if you don't have a lot of tank items, you can definitely consider playing 4 Ox 5 Renegade. And this board, especially with a fully itemized Viego, maybe a hero augment on your Jhin, should be strong enough to get you a top 4. If you have Renegade +1, but you've slammed a bunch of tank items, you can consider playing Aegis. This is especially good if you have a very high AB lobby. Then you definitely want to look to play Aegis anyway, because it will just be a fair bit tankier than your 4 Ox Force. Also, with Spellslinger's Ox being so contested, you can't always play the Ox Force units, so 3 Aegis is definitely something you can look towards as well. Assuming you have a Renegade emblem. Okay, let's now assume you don't have a Renegade +1. This is a little bit unfortunate because, as I said before, it's usually pretty easy to hit your Renegade +1, but let's say you don't, you will have to play something like a Camille or a Silas instead, usually Camille because she's a little bit better. In this instance, having an Aegis frontline is really easy to play. You always want Alistair in because he will give you Ox Force and he'll give you Mascot, and then you can just add in an Echo because he'll give you Aegis, and eventually you'll be selling your Camille / Silas for your Leona, giving you yet another Aegis. So if you don't have Renegade +1, this is probably my favorite version of the board to play. There is, however, an option to drop as many shitters as you possibly can and play some threat units instead. Something like this is very, very sus. If you end up in this position, I do feel sorry for you. I don't think you'll be getting any top 4s with a board like this, but at least you can minimize some losses. Playing 5 Renegades will allow you to kill a lot of units, and then you basically just frontline the Aatrox and hope that he can tank as much as possible. He did get buffed recently. The buffs weren't really to his tankiness, they were more just to his damage / healing, which I guess does make him a bit tankier, but it's not like going to be a huge amount. If you get more dogged into a position like this, it could actually be better to drop out of the Renegades, because then you don't have to play as many shitters. Like 9 times out of 10, it's going to be better to drop the Renegade here, and maybe drop the Renegade here as well, and then just put a stronger frontline back on, like Mascot and Aegis. In this version of the board with more threats, if you slammed a static Shiv in the early game, just remember Shiv Morgana is a really, really good strategy right now, and will work really well with Jhin, especially if you don't have a Last Whisper on him. So just keep that in mind as well. Another version that you might have seen recently is what happens if you get like a mascot emblem. Because 4 mascot actually is pretty tanky, especially if you put the mascot emblem on the Aatrox. In that case, what you're probably doing is you're dropping like the Echo, and you're just putting in another mascot, which is like a Malphite or a Nunu. And playing this board is really strong, or again, if you have more AP items, you're going to want to play an ASOL instead. Put the tank items on the Aatrox, put the damage items on your ASOL, and run Jhin ASOL duo carry. Okay, but what about if we decide to do mascots and we decide to re-roll some mascot units instead? Like, let's say you're looking to play Jhin, but you hit Infinite Vexes and maybe you hit a Vex Hero Augment instead. Don't get me wrong, it's still a Jhin duo carry, but instead what you want to do is you want to prioritize building some AP items on your Vex. Do something like a Shiv Morgana instead, max AP items on your Vex, and then you get mascot +1, and what you want to do is roll down for Malphite 3 and Vex 3. And then you can stabilize your board pretty easily with something like this. You can even consider, as you're rolling down, get a Pyke 3 as well, because Pyke 3 is an absolute menace. He's super tanky and he does some decent frontline damage and stuns everybody. You would play this board if you already have a lot of like mascot units early on, if you hit a mascot +1, and if you have to play a Vex Hero Augment. Then you can consider doing this, especially if you've already built some AP items and a static shiv. Then you can definitely consider playing this board as well, and this will be totally fine for a top 4 also. If you do have a renegade +1, these 4 units are the best units to put it on, and which ones you play will be dependent on what you level up first, what you actually hit, and what items you have more than anything. So as you can see, we have 2 AD units and we have 2 AP units. So pretty much if you have a lot of AP items, you want to put them on, you want to renegade the ASOL or the Mordekaiser. The only reason why you play Mordekaiser instead of ASOL is if number 1, you don't have any mana generation. Mordekaiser can be pretty good in that instance, and if you have something like 2 Rabhats or Rabhat JG, and if you get a Mordekaiser 2 for free, then you can consider swapping out ASOL for the Mordekaiser. What makes Mordekaiser so good with the Renegade spat is he does increased damage and then executes afterwards. So the increased damage plus the execute can end up winning you a lot of fights and being super broken. If you have mana gen, however, it's almost always better to go ASOL rather than Mordekaiser, even at level 2, because ASOL can also like set fire to the entire enemy board, and it just means that like they don't get as much healing. But if you have a bunch of leftover AD, then you can play Renegade Urgot as well. It'll be Renegade Belveth first until you hit an Urgot. I find in this board in particular, there's not a lot of CC. No matter which version you play, like it's pretty much just Pyke and maybe Morgana that can CC people depending on the version, and it's not a lot. So I find that as soon as I get an Urgot 1, I'm almost always taking off the Belveth and swapping the items on Urgot for a board-wide stun. If you have a mix of AD and AP, then again it's Urgot, especially if it's mana generation, because he farms infinite more off of Spear of Shojin, and he can actually use a spare AD item. The best 4 and 5 cost hero augments to go along with this board will depend on your spot. I really like Rule of 4, which is the Jhin one, which gives you like up to 4 gold per execute. The reason why this one is super handy is because, again, this board is so contested that when you roll down, you will become stable, but it's probably more value to you to hit upgrade units than it is just to get the bonus damage from Jhin. The only reason why you would take the damage Jhin one is if you already have a lot of upgraded units and maybe you already have a Jhin 2, or you're going to be really close to a Jhin 2 if you take it. So in that instance, it would be better to take the damage Jhin one, which is just all backline units gain like a % bonus damage. The Viego ones kind of suck. The Viego support one is alright at best, but if you're playing this board, there's no reason why you would ever take it, unless you literally have no Jhin items. But if that is the case, are you really going to be playing Renegade Viego? It's just not that good. I don't mind the Aatrox ones as well. They are kind of alright if for some reason you don't hit Jhin ones. I think Jhin ones are just the best, and because you have 4 rolls, you can almost always hit one, but Aatrox is fine as well. 5 cost ones, the Leona augments are fine, particularly the one that makes your team take 20 less damage. Again, I think the Jhin ones are better, but if it's somehow you really want to take Leona, you can, it's alright. Urgot and Fiddlesticks are takeable as well, particularly the Urgot one. A lot of people play Renegade Fiddlesticks. I'm not really sure why, it sucks. Just like, don't do it. Unless you have a Fiddlesticks 2 or something. Renegade Urgot is a lot better. Oh, and the very final version of the board, which I forgot to mention, is Mecha Prime Leona. I have seen this one, not as much because it relies so heavily off of a Leona 2, and even then it's not the best. But let's say you get the Leona carry augment and you high roll a Leona 2, you can consider playing it, it's not too bad. All you want to do is Mecha Prime the Leona. Leona really likes 2 tank items and then +1 healing because she does a ton of damage, so she can heal herself back up. Bloodthirster or Hextech Gunblade is a question for the ages. It doesn't really matter, both of them are good. Obviously, the biggest problem with this board is Leona can get bursted down pretty easily. So a Bramble Vest is really nice on her as well. Bramble Vest Declaw plus healing is generally what I think is the best. You can just go 3 tank items as well if you don't have the healing, and that will be totally fine. Okay, and that will just about sum everything up today, guys. I want to thank you all very much for watching this video, and just keep in mind that coming into the end of the set is a fantastic time to try and hit new peaks. This was the first set ever that I actually was able to hit Grandmaster, which I was super proud of. And following guides like this and listening to other people talk about how they play the game and different boards that they can play really let me learn all the different lines, which really helped me to be able to hit. So if you're in a similar situation, and no matter what rank you are, whether it's gold, bronze, platinum, challenger, if you're trying to hit that next peak, this is a great default board to play. I hope this video helped you out. If it did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.